Welcome back, everybody, to another Tech Note. This is the official, unofficial part 2 of anti-squat with a bonus. There's a bonus in this one. Today we will be discussing anti-dive, which is the same as anti-squat, but it's in the front. Jake is back, as you can see, here on the bench. His tires are already ready to go. See, we're learning how to save time. We'll move his body. We will go through the same process that we did before, where we will draw a line for the ground. We will draw a line for our known CGH. We know the point of the CGH. That's going to go on there. We will draw a line representative of the contact patch of the rear tire to the CGH line. We will draw a line from the contact patch of the front tire to the CGH line. We've been here before, and I could reuse those graphics, but everything got moved around. So, then we need to draw lines to extend the upper and lower front links, just as we did before, to the point where they intersect the back. This will be a little different because I'm going to have to really snake under there. You can't really even barely see. I probably should have laid him out the other way because of a 3-link. The link is on that side. Once we have that intersection point for the front end to find the instant center, the distance between wherever that point falls, and I'm assuming it's going to be in this area, wherever that point falls to the ground is the instant center. So obviously the anti-dive values, just as before when we saw anti-squat, the CGH line is 100%. Anything above that is above 100%. Anything below that is below 100%. Now, how will these values behave, you might ask? And I would like to point out here relatively quickly that we have, as drivers of toy rock crawlers, we have virtually no control over the length and the mounting of our lower links. They are determined by the chassis and the lower link mounting points, and in 99 times out of 100 there is one lower link mounting point both on the chassis and on the axle. That out of the way, we will discuss anti-dive above 100%, which is going to be fairly rare on a rock crawler, particularly a scale one. Anti-dive above 100%, the front end will not compress under braking, which, try to think of a vehicle offhand that does not have what they call nosedive, that the front does not descend under braking. That's just what they do. I mean, a vehicle, independent suspension or live axles, under braking, the vehicle is going to pivot this way. Apparently you can set up links in such a way, if you had an unlimited chassis, in order to make that not happen. Also, if anti-dive is above 100%, the front end will compress under acceleration. So it will basically behave the opposite of every vehicle you've ever seen. Under acceleration, the vehicle will go like this, and under braking, the vehicle will go like this. Which, let's just essentially rule that out, because that's not us. We're not going to get there. Anti-dive, once again, anti-dive above 100%. Weight transfer under acceleration, because it drops its nose under acceleration, it's not going to move a lot of weight to the rear wheels, which would really make your traction crazy, because under initial acceleration, the rear wheels are doing most of the work because weight transfers. So in an anti-dive above 100%, the rear wheels aren't doing much. You're being pulled by the front end. So perhaps a front-wheel drive car might behave a little bit like this if the suspension is set up properly, but I don't, let's remove properly and say set up to do that. I don't know if that is something that anyone genuinely desires. Now, where we live would be anti-dive at 100% or below 100%. I think we could tweak positions enough to get to 100%, to get those link lines. Once again, depending on how you angle your front axle, depending on how you mess with stuff, because we do have the ability to alter that angle, particularly if, like here, the C-hubs can be clocked. Any dive under 100%, front suspension compresses under braking, like almost everything. I mean, a tank compresses the front end under braking. And the front end will, choose your term, lift, extend, rise, whatever. When a power is applied to the rear wheels, the front end is going to come up. So I think the best we could hope for in an optimal crawling situation is to try to get our anti-dive as close to 100% as possible. I don't think we can get over, but I think we can perhaps get near 100%. Because 100% anti-dive, meaning that the anti-dive line and the CGH line are the same line, means that there's effectively no suspension transfer under acceleration. So that would be acceleration in this plane, but the acceleration on any inclined plane as well. There would be no effective transfer. The only is so you're not going to have power transfer. So 100% anti-dive would be effectively no torque twist, no, what do they call it? What do we call it when the front end rises, or when you get the when I speak of torque twist, I mean this. So because the suspension is controlling that. If you tip in the throttle and your rig tips like this, that is a function of anti-dive. So if you can minimize that, great. And it behaves very similar to the way anti-squat does, which is the relationship, in general, the front link, upper link here, is going to be fairly close to parallel. There's more of a triangle here, and you generally want more of a triangle here. I still believe he needs a rear link riser. But here in the front, we don't have the ability really to rise the link. He's pretty close. I don't know how well you can see in there, but you know, the way a pumpkin works, the mount point for the front upper and the rear upper link are effectively identical. We do have control over the length of the front link and the point in which it is mounted. The chassis that I made here only has 3 mount positions, so I can really only adjust length. I can't adjust its verticality, which is kind of a bummer, but looking at the way it's laid out, if I wanted to raise the chassis mounting point of my front upper link, it would kind of be out here in open space. So the design of the chassis is not conducive to that. I will do, of course, it should already be being displayed in graphics. What is here? The front links are definitely more parallel to the ground than the rears. And where that is going to lead us is into the secondary portion of this discussion, which is, someone asked, why do we do this? What is the effect of an angled shock versus a vertical shock? And I'll tell you right now, these are Element blue band, these are Traxxas no band. What that means is that this shock is 2.09 pounds per inch. And the way a linear spring behaves is if you take one of these springs, and the only other blue band spring I could find is a Traxxas. So we will treat that as the same thing. So let's pretend that this spring is the same as that one. We'll let the blue band fool our brains. I don't recall offhand what the rate on a Traxxas blue is, but it's pretty stiff. So this, for purposes of demonstration, is a Element blue band spring, 2.09 pounds per inch, which means if I compress this spring 1 inch, it requires 2.09 pounds of force to do that. To compress it 2 inches, requires double that, 4.18 pounds of force. They are linear. No matter how many inches, this is a roughly, what are these guys, 70? Well, I have a measure here. Yeah, these are 63 millimeter springs, which is about 2 3/8 inches. So to compress it 3/8 of an inch is a third of 2 pounds, which is like 0.6 pounds. So about 4 3/4 pounds of force to completely collapse that spring. Now that is in the event that the spring is run like this, perfect 90 degrees, parallel to the axle, perpendicular to the ground. As you lean a shock over, the shock doesn't know, the shock doesn't care, but the spring does. The spring, the shock angle is going to affect the rate of the spring. It is going to affect it linearly. So as you lean it more and more, it's going to continue to affect the rate. And what happens is, as a shock leans over, it effectively becomes softer. So this shock is 2.09 pounds per inch, standing at 90 degrees. And there is a correction factor, an angle correction factor, the ACF, which is involves trigonometry. There's cosine and whatnot. The formula, which I will throw up here on the screen, I have written it down. ACF, the angle correction factor, is cosine of the angle A, which I guess that's the angle of the shock. So this, which in terms of this shock is at 49 degrees. So we would do cosine of 49 degrees. And in the front, we would do the cosine of 55 degrees. Basically, the way it breaks is, let's lay it out as simply as possible. It moves through I don't know what this arc is. I don't know if this is, I don't think it's an exponential arc. I don't think it's a logarithmic arc. I don't know what this arc is. This is a cosine arc. Trigonometry is where my brain effectively turns off. Like, I run out of teacher, can I be excused? My brain is full. But what I can say is that if a shock is at a 45 degree angle, and this one's almost there, the angle correction factor is 0.71. So you would multiply 2.09 times 0.71, which will give you 1.48 and change. So if I had a big enough calculator here, and perhaps I can do that once once this is in the edit, I can multiply 49 times cosine, and we'll get that number, which will give us a number. It'll give us a fractional number. It will be point something. So for frame of reference, a 10 degree shock angle is 0.98. It's only softening the spring by basically 2%. Is that right? I don't want to get too deep into the math. 15 degrees is going to soften it to 0.96, so 4% softer. 20 degrees, 0.94, and on and on and on until you get to 45 degrees is a 0.71. So if this guy was at 45 degrees, he'd be at 1.5 pounds, but he's at 49 degrees. So effectively, the only reason you're laying a shock over, well, okay, in terms of suspension theory, if we're clumping it in suspension theory, you're leaning a shock over to soften it up, to give you a softer effective rate. Because this guy has so little weight on the rear axle that even a 2-pound spring is pretty stiff. But at the same time, if I drop down to something really soft and he transfers weight up this way, look at where the shock is now. The shock is now at 90 degrees. So a lot of it is trial and error and doing a correction factor to determine your effective rate at rest. And you can do all the math. You can say, well, when I'm nose high like this and my shock is at a 72 degree angle, which is actually an 18 degree angle. Yes, it's clearing up in my head now, because so there is, well, I'm already past. Their 90 is right about there. So that is actually a 10-degree shock angle. So it's actually at 80. So in that position right there, the spring is 2% softer. So when you're selecting your springs to set up your spring rates, you don't want to look just at the linear rate of the spring, because the shock is almost never going to be in that position. So when you have a shock angled like this, or angled to whatever hole that you choose, essentially the different rows of verticals are to set your height. The different holes fore to aft are effectively to tune your spring rate, because as you move through the arc, the spring is going to get stiffer and stiffer and stiffer until it's as stiff as it's going to be. So that's why you'll see, like in a cantilever, they've got to run like crazy, super tight. They look like valve springs. They're so tightly coiled because there's so much force. There's a multiplicative force acting on the spring. So I'm I could use this hole, but I'm effectively as far as forward as I can go. I'm at 49 degrees, which is actually 41 degrees. So it's going to be in that 1.5, 1.55 pounds per inch static. And then as it moves through the arc like this, when he gets to there, he's at 2.09. So there you have it. That is why we angle springs. That's why his front angle is a little less, and I'm going to have to tinker with that. But as I've mentioned in the anti-squat video, make an effort to make one change at a time. I forgot to see if I could order a link riser, so I'm just going to start by moving him up a hole and adjusting the link accordingly. And after I've tested that, I am going to mess with some front shock mounting holes to see if having him stiffer or softer static affects how he is stiffer, because it's an arc, right? So you have the arc that begins here at static, and when you're way up here, when the nose is well lifted, there's effectively no weight. The front is drooping, regardless of how much physical droop it might actually have. When you're at an aggressive angle climbing, your front end is drooping and your rear end is compressed. So you have to look at this invisible arc. We'll see if I can put in an arc that goes across here. As the shock moves through that arc, the front end is stiffening, and you can't stiffen the front end. So a front end, you kind of set, and by you, I mean me, I set statically, right? Because the suspension is doing most of its work when the front end has load on it. So you have to take account for the fact that the front end in general weighs significantly more than the rear end. Now in the rear is the real workhorse when climbing, because the rear is doing everything it can to keep the front wheels on the ground, both in the design of the suspension links in the rear and the orientation of the springs. So I want my springs to be this level of softness when it's sitting on level ground, and I want my springs to be a certain amount of softness when the vehicle is rising. So part of the consideration, part of the setup, is to get that rear end where it sits right there. But then as you climb, I mean, you can see even right there, without me pushing down on it, that front end just starts to drop because the weight is transferring through the spring. So this guy, when he's up to right there, which would be 49-degree climb angle, which we're not really going to do much better than that, honestly. At that point, his rear spring rate is as high as it's going to go. And that's how you tinker with springs. You can, if you only have a couple of springs in a couple different rates, like if you've got 265s and 20s, if you've got a different set of these with shock holes, or if you don't have access to multiple shock holes like that, shock keys, if you can put keys on, laying the shock down will give you a softer static rate that will move through an arc. And the more you lay it down, the stiffer of a spring you can run. So if I laid this, like if I bolted this shock down over here, I would have to run like even stiffer than in the front. I would have to get up around 3 pounds per inch. But then when he's risen up Then see, he'd be able to rise all the way to there before it got to 90. So this is the real, once again, this is how you get into the minutia. This is how you get into the super tinker. But don't be like me. Make one change at a time. And I mean literally. Like if you want to move a rear shock mounting position, move that one, then mess with the front shock mounting position. Knowing that hopefully the rear shocks are honestly doing more than the front shocks. Front shocks are here to keep the front end off the ground, and they're to do the lion's share of work during descending. The rear shocks are what are helping you climb. So hopefully I managed to cover that quickly enough. That is, we will call this a primer again. This is the primer on anti-dive, and I think I did a decent cover on why we angle our shocks. So that out of the way, that's another tech note in the books. If you have anything else you'd like me to address, please do let me know, and I will do my very best to address that. I hope that the white background doesn't blow out the color on this too much. We'll see. I really need to fabricate some sort of backdrop here. Like, let's try to stay professional here, people. This one's got a big black line in it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you have any other tech-related questions or questions of any kind, feel free to throw them my way, and I will do my very best to address them to the best of my abilities. Once again, thank you for watching, and we do sincerely look forward to seeing you in the next one.